All right, let's get right into it. A legal bombshell has just been dropped by the Federal Court of Appeal, and it's all about the government's use of a tool so powerful it had never, ever been used before in Canadian history. We are talking about the Emergencies Act, and this landmark ruling, it could change everything we thought we knew about the limits of government power in a crisis.
To really wrap our heads around what's at stake here, we've got to rewind to the pretty wild events of February 2022. It was a moment that split the country, a moment when this historic power was unleashed for the very first time, and it kicked off a massive debate about government power in a democracy.
So this timeline really lays out just how fast things went from 0 to 60. You have the protests starting in late January, then just a couple of weeks later, local authorities are declaring states of emergency, and then bam, on February 14th, the federal government makes history by invoking the Emergencies Act. Now, it only lasted 9 days before it was revoked, but the legal fight that followed, well, that's taken years to get to this point.
Okay, this right here is so important to understand. It's at the very heart of this whole debate. The old War Measures Act, that thing was a sledgehammer. It basically gave the government a blank check, and history shows us that led to some serious abuses. That's why the Emergencies Act was created in 1988. It was designed to be totally different. Think of it as a scalpel, not a hammer, with strict legal guardrails built right in to protect our rights. This idea is absolutely central to the court's decision.
So, after all the arguments, after all the debate, what did the court actually say? Well, the Federal Court of Appeal, the highest court to rule on this so far, delivered a verdict that is sending shockwaves through Canada's legal and political landscape.
This single sentence pretty much says it all: unreasonable and ultra-vires. That last one is just a fancy legal term for acting beyond your legal power. So what the court is saying here, in plain language, is that the government crossed a line and didn't have the legal authority to do what it did. Let's dig into why they came to that conclusion.
The court's decision really stands on two massive pillars. First, they said the situation just didn't meet the Act's super strict definition of an emergency. And second, they found that the measures the government took actually violated the fundamental rights that are guaranteed to all of us in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Now, what's so critical to understand is that the government had to pass both of these tests. It wasn't an either-or kind of deal. And according to the court, they failed on both counts. So let's tackle that first one. Was this even a national emergency, according to the letter of the law? The court called the decision unreasonable, and it really boils down to this. They concluded that the situation on the ground, as disruptive as it was, simply didn't meet that high-stakes, very narrow definition of an emergency that is written directly into the law itself. And here we go, this is the key legal trigger. The Emergencies Act actually points to another law, the CSIS Act, for its definition. And the government's entire argument hinged on the idea that the protests involved, and I'm quoting here, acts of serious violence. That specific phrase, serious violence, is everything. And this just lays out the massive gap perfectly. The law demands a threat of serious violence. The court looked at all the evidence and said, you know, these protests were incredibly disruptive, no question. They caused huge economic problems. But that's not the same thing as serious violence. The court drew a very clear line. Economic disruption, even if it's massive, does not equal a national security threat as defined by this very specific law.
So on that first test, the court says the government failed. But they didn't stop there. This brings us to the second pillar of their decision, because the court found that even if there had been a national emergency, the specific things the government did with that power went too far and were unconstitutional.
The first charter right they looked at was freedom of expression. This is, a bedrock of our democracy. It protects our right to protest, to say what we believe, especially when those views are unpopular. The court found these new rules were just way too broad. They didn't just target the illegal blockades. They basically made it illegal to peacefully protest anywhere in the country. Think about it. They banned things like giving food or donating a few bucks to someone who was just peacefully participating. The court said the government used a sledgehammer when a scalpel was needed, which, as we saw, goes against the entire point of the modern Emergencies Act. Next up, the court took a hard look at one of the most controversial measures of the whole thing, the power to freeze people's bank accounts without a court order. And this runs right into our charter right to be safe from unreasonable search and seizure. I mean, the court found this whole process was a clear charter violation. It allowed banks and other financial institutions to freeze your money and hand over your private information, all without a warrant, with no judge involved, based on some vague, subjective idea of who was a designated person. And get this, there was no process at all for people to challenge the seizure of their own money. The court literally called it ad hoc and fraught with confusion, an unreasonable seizure.
Okay, so we've broken down the why the court found the use of the act was both unreasonable and unconstitutional. But the biggest question is still hanging out there. What does this all mean for the future?
You might be sitting there thinking, okay, the emergency is over, the protests are long gone, why does this court ruling from years later even matter? Well, this is about way more than what happened back in 2022. This is all about what happens next time.
Here's the bottom line. This ruling sets a massive precedent. It draws a very clear line in the sand. It sends a message to any government, now or in the future, that the Emergencies Act is not a tool of convenience. It is a weapon of absolute last resort, and there is a very, very high legal bar that has to be cleared first. This decision basically puts steel back into those guardrails we talked about earlier.
Now, a ruling from the Federal Court of Appeal is a huge deal. But believe it or not, this story might not be over just yet.
The federal government still has one more card to play. It can ask the Supreme Court of Canada to hear an appeal. If the top court agrees, then we are heading for a final, definitive showdown. And that leaves us all with a pretty fundamental question to think about. In a moment of crisis, where exactly do we draw the line between keeping people safe and protecting the very freedoms that define a democracy? That's the question this case is forcing all of us to confront.